Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us Mikaela Nhondo Erskog with No Cold War and the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We invite her here today to discuss a dossier that she wrote for the Tricontinental titled The Sahel Seeks Sovereignty. Thank you for being here with us, Mikaela.
Thank you so much for having me, Dae-Han.
So just getting started with the first question. At the heart of this year are Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In it, you mentioned that the coups that took place there in 2020, 2022, and 2023 were carried out by the progressive factions of the military. And we don't often think of the military, much less a coup, as playing a progressive role. In addition, it seems like an important element of the story is also like French neocolonialism and this notion of like flag independence. So if you could just give us a brief background about these progressive factions of the military, for example, like what was the context of their emergence, what was their intention, and what is support for them like?
Thank you so much, and I highly encourage anyone who's really interested in understanding the situation in the Sahel to actually read the Tricontinental dossier, which is freely available in multiple languages. So I think first is actually the backdrop that Niger is one of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, but Niger in particular, which was the last coup or most recent coup, and where I was fortunate enough last year to go to a solidarity conference for the people in the Sahel and actually speak to people, meet people. And part of the dossier is based on discussion, interviews, and conversations with people who are active at the grassroots level, in the social movements, trade unions, student organizations. And it was really shocking to me. I've never been in the capital city, the capital Niamey, that is, I think, one of the most underdeveloped so-called capital cities I've ever seen. So, where the largest buildings are the Radisson Blu, the Ministry of Finance is quite big, and then the biggest expanses is actually the U.S. Embassy, which I'm not sure if it's still operational, but in November 2024, at the time, was still operational. It was sitting right next to the French embassy, which was also a huge, huge, huge complex. But luckily, it was in the dark because they had been kicked out by that time. And so these are contexts in which there's huge levels of underdevelopment due to colonial and neo-colonial legacies, despite the fact that not so far away is one of the richest iron ore grades in Africa of uranium. And in fact, there was a study a couple of years ago that showed that 1 in 3 French light bulbs were being powered by 2 of the uranium mines. Yet in Niger itself, most people don't have access to electricity, let alone plugged into the grid. So there's no like national electrification for most of the population. And so this is the context that of it's an extremely the whole region is an extremely underdeveloped society and continue to have a domination of French companies, French monopolies owning and benefiting from the mines. I think one of the figures is that of all uranium exports to Niger, the revenues that they were able to retain was less than 20% from the export of uranium, which is their primary, at the time was their primary export. Then what do we mean by progressive factions in uniform? So one is that, and I think this is also a problem amongst the left, is that the military is not a class in and of itself. It has different ties to different sectors of society. And there has been a historical comprador bourgeoisie who use the military, but being in the military doesn't mean you're inherently progressive or inherently, regressive. And I think we know this from the experiences of Venezuela with Hugo Chavez. We have our own experiences in Africa of many national liberation struggles that were the most progressive and that ended up getting the largest sum of suppression were led by military leaders like Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel. And this is precisely because we found ourselves in contexts in which it was only through armed struggle that there could be a liberation. So that's one. But two is that the kind of and maybe for a bit of context, since 1950 till about 2019, 2020, I think Africa makes up 50% of all successful coup attempts in the world. So if there were 400 and something coup attempts, I think that's the number, since 1950, half of them have been in Africa. So I think the kind of Western picture of it does have to do with the fact that they have also been historically regressive and conservative, anti-democratic, and by democratic I mean people-centered coups, but they essentially were installments of Western interests in the continent, right? We saw that with the coup in 1966 against Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and in many, many parts. There's a lot of very clear literature about the Western-backed, US-backed, French-backed coups in the late 70s, 80s in particular. And this was at the time of the structural adjustment programs. And so those went hand in hand with a certain type of economic liberalization. Then looking specifically at some of these leaders, these are also slightly different from, I think, the colonels we've seen in the past, the kind of more opportunistic. And obviously only time will tell, as Fidel said, history will absolve us. But what we see with these younger officers, they seem to have a slightly different patriotism. Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, openly models himself on Thomas Sankara, speaks about, quotes him frequently, speaks about developing a patriotic agenda, talks about Pan-Africanism, talks about people-led initiatives, etc. And the reason that they also, I think, are considered to have some progressive elements, at minimum, let's call them anti-imperialist and patriotic, that they want to, take back control of their country for their people, is that three reasons I can briefly list. Is one, most of these, like Traore, etc., are captains and people who fought on the front lines of the counter-terrorism struggles. And, since the bombing of Libya by the US-led and NATO attacks, and basically that opened up a kind of stream of jihadist extremists and forms of extremist violence groups that also come out of the Iraq moment and things like that, but who are preying on people who are essentially dissatisfied with their society. So it's poor people who join these things. It's not just a kind of idealistic thing about religion, but it's because somebody's offering you solutions in extremely challenging circumstances. So a lot of these military leaders who are part of the government came out of the failure of decades of so-called counterterrorism operations led by the French and the US, like the G5 Sahel, which was the French initiative. And since 2011, we've only seen the situation worse and increase in terms of the attacks, the deaths that are a result of this. So that's one. Two is that they've aligned themselves with popular anger. So but even prior to them coming in, we saw cycles of mass protests that were directing it against what was considered neo-colonial French arrangements. The fact that we continue to be in the CFA franc, where basically our currency is denominated according to the French Treasury's monetary policies, right? So we don't have monetary sovereignty. And these mass protests, not only, and this is another thing that I don't think is well known, is in the case of Niger, for example, when the military coup happened, it was people's organizations and grassroots organizations that quickly went to the streets, that surrounded the French embassy, that surrounded a French military base, and also set the agenda and called for an ejection of the French military and a break with France. So there's also a dialectic happening between the people setting the agenda and being protagonistic and their support for the military leaders. But it goes both ways. There was a young student at this conference who said, we're offering our support, but it's not unconditional support. It will be based on your ability to advance a sovereign development agenda, a people-centered agenda, etc. And that's the other part, is that they talk about sovereignty and development. They didn't just, seize the barracks. They announced concrete shifts that we've already seen in terms of, one, that they created this Alliance of Sahel States, which initially was a defense compact in September 16th, 2023, where ECOWAS, which is the Economic Cooperation of West African States and kind of coordinates economic cooperation in the region, basically threatened military intervention into Niger just after the coup happened in Niger. And Mali and Burkina Faso basically came together to the aid of Niger and said, if an injury to one is an injury to all. And so initially it started as a collective defense pact, but we've seen it quickly grow where they, the following year, I think it's July of 2024, they signed agreements to basically start to build a confederation where they would cooperate in terms of their economic policy, in terms of their governance policies, education, things like that. So they have also taken on this kind of, they recently, earlier this year, announced that they were creating a confederal development bank so that they could invest in their infrastructure development, etc. And so they're showing concretely a willingness, at least, even if it might be just in word, and we still are yet to see the concrete outcome really take on a definitively different quality. They're taking certain measures that are about sovereignty and that also create more space for anti-imperialists and anti-capitalists across the continent to have a dialogue and a meaningful dialogue and meaningful interventions. And then lastly, I'll just quickly mention that now the fact that it's also a regional entity is really important. They've talked about integrating their market, creating a common passport. They already have a joint armed forces and different shared projects. They've spoken about how to and are developing plans around how uranium can be mined and mined in Niger and then refined through nuclear power processing in Burkina Faso and Mali. And so they're thinking about then how do we have like shared responsibility in electrifying our region and our countries. So these are some of the progressive steps that we've seen that we think at minimum show like good faith, that they're acting in good faith. But ultimately, it's not a guarantee, both due to domestic factors as well as external factors.
Great, thank you. I guess how are the developments in the Sahel shaping and also being shaped by the larger seismic shifts towards a more multipolar world?
Now, I think this is also the reason, not the reason, but a reason why we decided to do the study when we did it, aside from the actual timing of the events, is that in 2024 January, we launched at Tricon a document called Hyperimperialism, where we tried to give a sober assessment of the world conjuncture, basically trying to understand when we look at the world, whose interests are being represented by whom, who is on the side of humanity, who is actively acting against it. And we tried to, we looked more closely at the global north, and it started off with looking at the fact that the US-led global north, what we consider to be a bloc, they coordinate militarily, politically, economically, and they're subordinated due to the fact that the US has a monopoly on military spending and therefore has a monopoly on coercion in the world. But we also tried to look at the global south and look at some of the trends. And so for us, we saw the Sahel, or the Alliance of Sahel States, because the Sahel is bigger than those three countries, by the way. But with the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, we saw a tendency that is also happening in other countries in the world that we called strongly seeking sovereignty. So this would be the camp of the world, or a grouping of countries in the world that are actively fighting imperialism. They sit alongside countries like Russia. They sit alongside countries like Iran, like Belarus, basically those who are also heavily under attack through sanctions and other means by the West, but who are considered to be threats to the Western system. So that's the first, is that there are countries who are taking more quote unquote aggressive steps to break dependency and to break the historical boot on the neck of formerly colonized people. That's one. Two is that the world economy has shifted significantly, and we call this like a southward shift, where due to the rise of China, due to even the rise of big income countries like India, Turkey, Russia, countries who you may not politically align with, but who are carving out more space economically. This has also shifted the balance of forces, where we're seeing that the global south and Africa has alternative offerings of finance, energy, industrial investment, etc. I mentioned earlier the nuclear power plants in Niger and Mali are in part, I think, come from agreements with Russia from one of the subsidiaries of Rostam, the big energy company. And so, and with the rise of China, again, alternative financing is being created. So this gives people a little bit more bandwidth to make choices about their own, domestic policy and regional policy. So having the this basically opens up the opportunity to say no, because they say that you don't bite the hand that feeds you, because as soon as you break with the French, you get sanctioned, you get politically demonized, etc. So now, and that can really chokehold and strangle a country. And so knowing that there are other alternatives. And again, not just, I saw a lot of Indian companies in Niger, for example, which again, no one's coming for altruistic purposes, but still having a different option helps to leverage your choices, and also for the continent and the regions to use stronger collective bargaining power. And this is also why the fact that they have created a confederation is so important, because you can't develop when you're one little small country here, a small country there. Each of them individually have around 20 to 25 million people in their population, which that's the population of Shanghai, like you need to be able to develop at scale. And so now they have around 72 million or so people together. It's important. So one is that new bilateral, multilateral relationships have created also the opportunity for people to make slightly different choices, and the rise of other financiers, cooperation partners also creates a little bit more space. Then the other is that countries are seeing, after the Ukraine war began in 2022, half of the African countries didn't vote in favor of the UN vote against Russia. Sorry, I'm forgetting the exact wording. And I think it's because also a lot of countries see, like, this is what happens. Look what happens to Russia, gets completely cut off from the international financial instruments and trade instruments because of its choice to pursue, sovereignty and for territorial sovereignty. So I think that there's like a mood. Vijay, who I work with, he talks about there's a mood in the global south based on the fact how the West weaponized financial systems against you. It's too early to really say whether or not certain things are going to succeed, but I think the fact that there is the choice of architecture has widened, the fact that new regionalisms are emerging all over the world, the fact that people have seen the kind of chokehold that having a single currency can have on a country. They've had many discussions about trying to get out of the CFA franc, which I mentioned most of former French colonized countries in Africa still have to use. Because of these things, that has created a little bit of the bigger geopolitical picture, has created the reason why this is happening now in terms of the Sahel, and why we think it has a little bit of an anti-imperialist tenor towards it.
Great, thank you. This is quite fascinating, and I encourage everybody to take a look at the dossier that goes into far greater detail. My last question was, what would you say is the current state of these movements for national sovereignty, like right at this moment, like what is happening right now? And yeah, as we kind of step into the future.
So I think the short answer is it's promising, but it's contested. It's still in construction. They still need to institutionalize certain things that are written on paper. So, and the AES is moving from slogans to a little bit of scaffolding. And we see this in all dimensions, whether it has to do with agriculture, like Burkina Faso they built this tomato processing plant to create, tomato paste and canned goods, like smaller projects, building roads. But they initially started off with things like they coordinate this, but they still have to do it individually. So, for example, Mali was the first one to revise its mining code to increase the state share of mines, as well as increase the share of revenue that they wanted to retain. The same thing happened in Burkina Faso. But they also have certain differences because they're in different moments in their own, political process. But things like in Mali, for example, a year ago or 2 years ago, they put a new education or a new vision, like these like national visions of like the society we want. And the way it framed it, for example, around citizenship, sounded very much like how Che Guevara talked about creating the new human being or the new man, and where it defines citizenship as protagonistic, as active, as involved, as participatory, not in the sense of go and make a vote, which is why also there's the funny thing about the criticisms that, oh, these military leaders, they don't want the people to vote and they don't want to have elections. It's a complete farce, because what actually does it mean to participate in society democratically? Do we boil it down to a vote every 4 years? And the instability that often comes with it in most African countries, the policy, even if you get a progressive government, if they go out, that's completely undermined and you have to wait another 4 years. And so the process always gets disrupted. Sorry, that's tangential, but is to say that they're making interesting moves, but it will hinge on how they actually have some material outcomes. People want wages increased. People want electricity. People want, good education for their children. People, right now, I spoke to, on the airplane, a man from Mali who, when I was going to the conference, who works in Niger, in climate change, coming from the UN world of funding. But it was really interesting because he was like, no, we support this military because you don't understand how you can barely take a bus between cities in the north of Niger because the jihadist group will likely stop the car, rob the people, injure people. And so I think the first front that is important is that they are trying to secure the territorial security question. And so that will be the first, I think, that will show or prove to people if they're able to deliver on their word. So we need to A, see if they're able to deliver on their word, but B, we also need to figure out how to institutionalize the kind of grassroots participation and the kind of citizenry. And it also is contested in the sense that, for example, I don't know if you saw, but there were these huge headlines a couple of weeks ago saying Burkina Faso bans homosexuality. This is true. They had a new code of persons and family. And in the code of persons and family, they did say that behavior that encourages homosexual activity can see 3 to 5 years imprisonment and quite significant fines. I don't think that's good. I disagree with that. But what's behind it? Like, what is the issue it's trying to solve? It's not homosexuality. It's actually the family unit. Because of the incredible economic and social instability, they're trying to secure what Engels speaks about in Family, Property, and the State, secure the most basic productive and reproductive unit, which is the family. And so if we have a secure, we're getting like families together, in quote, and we are able to secure that, we also then can secure our labor force. They even reduced, so this is not seen within the larger context of what they're trying to resolve. And in fact, if you read the document, which is about 300 pages, there is a lot more about increasing rights for children, increasing clarification on registration of births, of deaths, just what it seems like simple things, but elements of governance that if you don't understand the age of your population, how many people are in your population, the location of the people in your population, then you don't really know how to use the human capacity to pursue a development agenda. And in conditions where you're having to fight basically a civil war in the northern part of your country, they also need to figure out ways of making government services, which they included or improved on, government services accessible to people in moments of conflict. And there are a whole bunch of things I can list that are related to this, but essentially they're trying to stabilize the citizenry by trying to better organize them according to family unit. And there's also a lot of things around improved rights for women and children as in terms of paternal, like that that the parents have to be responsible, and if that one parent behaves in this way, they have certain legal recourse to get, compensation, amelioration, support, state support, more clarity on how you can divorce. They also recognized polygamy as another part of the marriage regime, not because they believe necessarily that polygamy is progressive, but because this polygamy was happening unregulated. So the idea is that we need to understand better ways of regulating and governing our society. So this is just to give a bigger picture of what they're up against and what they're trying to do. And the test will be in their ability to, deliver the basic improvements, to institutionalize popular oversight. And the bigger, much harder thing is to move beyond raw exports into, refining, processing, and manufacturing power. And that's a lot harder and requires a lot more efforts that aren't insular to their countries, but are part of, like, how do they work with the African Union? How do they work with other countries to kind of regain economic sovereignty? Because at the moment, they still, all three countries, they all, prior to this, relied on, over 70% of their exports revenues came from three primary mineral resources. In the case of Burkina Faso and Mali, it was gold. And in the case of Niger, it was uranium. And so breaking that kind of dependency isn't something you can do overnight and can't do without regional integration and cooperation. Yeah, but I think that importantly, I think they also have raised the flag of the fact that the question of security is tied to development. Like if we don't have thriving economies, then of course we're going to have an issue of security, because the people who are impoverished will fall into the hands of extremist violence to find a means of resolving the issues of their life, what they see to be a failure of the state.
Great. Thank you so much. It's so fascinating, and it's actually quite hopeful when there's not many glimmers of hope around the world. But yeah, it's very exciting. And yeah, we'll keep continuing monitoring this. And thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much. And please do, anyone, reach out via Twitter, read the dossier. We'll continue to follow and work on this. And in Tricontinental, we're hoping in the future to have more concrete, like, country studies where we can try to figure out what actually is the path to breaking dependency and developing sovereign development agendas.